January 1943. The skies over occupied Europe are pale and hard, a winter light that turns aluminum to silver. From the western horizon, a sound rises, deep, rhythmic, like thunder rolling across the clouds, hundreds of engines, dozens of bombers, each one a fortress of steel and fire. The B-17 Flying Fortress, 4 engines, 13 guns and a crew of 10, cuts through the cold air at 25,000 feet. Below them, the land is gray and scarred, rivers frozen, towns still, factories humming with the machinery of war. In their oxygen masks, American airmen speak little. Frost forms on the inside of their goggles. The thin air burns their lungs. Ahead lies the heart of the German Reich, the industrial lifeline that fuels the Wehrmacht. Below, German spotters raise binoculars. The sirens begin to wail. Across the flat fields of France and Germany, anti-aircraft crews swing their guns skyward. They have seen these bombers before. They have mocked them before, but today the laughter begins to fade. For the first time, the Americans are coming in broad daylight, and they intend to stay. By late 1941, Europe was a continent at war. Germany had seized Poland, France had fallen, and the Luftwaffe reigned over the skies from the Atlantic coast to the Russian frontier. Britain stood alone, battered by relentless air raids yet defiant. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched, its military untested in the crucible of global conflict. When Pearl Harbor drew America into war on December 7, 1941, the U.S. military faced the monumental task of projecting air power across oceans and deep into the heart of Europe. The United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, faced a stark reality. Bombing in daylight without the cover of darkness was inherently perilous. Enemy fighters prowled the skies, flak batteries waited over every industrial hub, and European airspace was a maze of anti-aircraft defenses. Many American officers doubted the wisdom of sending unescorted bombers so far into enemy territory, yet the doctrine of precision bombing promised a decisive advantage. Strike directly at the factories, oil refineries and transportation hubs that fueled the Nazi war machine, and Germany's military might could be broken from the air. At the center of this strategy was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Designed in the mid-1930s, the B-17 had been built with one principle in mind: survivability. Aluminum skin over a steel frame, 4 engines for redundancy, and 13 defensive 50-caliber machine guns made it both durable and lethal. Engineers had envisioned a bomber that could penetrate enemy airspace and return, even under fire. Early tests suggested remarkable resilience. A B-17 could lose an engine or two and still maintain altitude. Control surfaces could be shredded without catastrophic failure. Crews could continue fighting even after sustaining heavy damage. The nickname Flying Fortress was not propaganda. Reports from initial flights described an aircraft that seemed almost invincible in its skyward armor. For the Americans, it represented hope, a tool that could, in theory, bring the fight to Germany's doorstep. For the Germans, however, it was initially dismissed. Luftwaffe officers wrote off the bomber as slow and vulnerable, a curiosity rather than a threat. They laughed at the notion that such lumbering machines could survive the firestorms of flak and fighters they had perfected over France and the Low Countries. Despite skepticism, the first waves of B-17 crews trained relentlessly. Pilots practiced formation flying over American heartlands. Engineers and gunners drilled endlessly, and navigators memorized maps of foreign skies. Morale was a mixture of pride and apprehension. These men understood the stakes. Every mission carried the weight of strategy and the peril of death. Across the Atlantic, the landscape of occupied Europe awaited them, dotted with factories churning out tanks, aircraft, and munitions for a war that seemed unstoppable. The early missions were cautious, small in scale, designed to test tactics and measure German response. Yet even these limited raids revealed the challenges of daylight bombing. Formation integrity was crucial. A single gap could invite swarms of enemy fighters. Flak bursts tore through formations, scattering bombers like leaves in a storm. Losses were inevitable, but each flight taught lessons in navigation, defense, and endurance. Crews returned with tales of resilience. Engines disabled, fuselage pierced, yet the aircraft still held together, bringing men home against impossible odds. The B-17's introduction marked a shift in air strategy. Unlike the Royal Air Force, which had relied on nighttime area bombing to evade fighters, the USAAF believed in daylight precision. Factories would be hit directly, supply lines would be disrupted, the war economy would feel the pressure, yet execution required overcoming immense challenges. The Luftwaffe's dominance of the skies, the geographical breadth of Europe, and the limited range of early fighter escorts. Every sortie was a high-stakes gamble, one that tested both machine and man to the limit. The Americans were undeterred. Commanders recognized that while losses would be high, the B-17 offered something unique: the promise of striking deep into enemy territory with a combination of firepower, armor, and strategic intent. Each mission was not just a bombing run. It was a demonstration that the United States could bring the war to the heart of Germany. The flying fortress, dismissed by the enemy as a cumbersome relic, was about to prove its value under fire. The stage was set. Crews would soon confront the combined fury of flak, fighters, and the harsh winter skies of Europe. Germany's industrial heart would not remain oblivious for long. By early 1943, the USAF had begun to expand its bombing campaign over Europe. Bases in England became launching points for long-range missions into the industrial heart of Germany. Cities such as Hamburg, Berlin, and the Ruhr Valley loomed as strategic objectives, hubs of aircraft production, tank manufacturing, and munitions supply. Each target promised a tangible impact on Germany's war effort, but each also posed enormous risk. Enemy flak formations had grown more sophisticated, and the Luftwaffe now anticipated the Americans' daylight raids. The doctrine of precision bombing guided every sortie. Unlike area bombing, which relied on saturation to damage a city, daylight raids demanded accuracy. Navigators calculated routes down to the mile. Bombardiers adjusted for wind and altitude with meticulous care. Crews trained to release bombs on tightly defined coordinates, targeting assembly lines, power plants, and rail yards. The idea was simple in theory but perilous in practice. The bombers had to fly in close formation at high altitudes, exposing themselves to both anti-aircraft fire and attacking fighters. One slip could scatter the formation and invite disaster. The Germans initially underestimated the threat. Commanders in the Luftwaffe considered the B-17's slow speed and predictable flight paths as vulnerabilities, imagining that their fighters could pick off formations with ease. Propaganda ridiculed the American bombers as overhyped and cumbersome. Factories continued production, confident that American bombers would not survive the gauntlet of defenses. But the Americans were learning rapidly. Each mission yielded critical insights into enemy tactics. Crews discovered how to adjust formation flying to maximize defensive fire, how to anticipate flak bursts, and how to evade sudden attacks from the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters. Early losses were steep. Entire squadrons were sometimes decimated. Yet the flying fortress proved remarkably resilient. Stories circulated of bombers returning with massive fuselage damage, shattered canopies, or crippled engines, yet the aircraft brought its crew home. These accounts began to shift German perceptions. Meanwhile, the U.S. command recognized the need for long-range fighter escort. The lack of protective cover for B-17s in deep German territory contributed to high casualty rates. P-47 Thunderbolts and later P-51 Mustangs extended the reach of American air power, providing vital defense against Luftwaffe interceptions. By combining heavy bombers with agile escort fighters, the Americans aimed to reduce losses while maintaining relentless pressure on Germany's war machine. The strategic impact of these raids was gradual but undeniable. Even in the early stages, factories suffered interruptions. Rail yards were destroyed, assembly lines slowed, and resources had to be diverted to repair and defense rather than production. Reports from intelligence units began to confirm that daylight precision bombing could, in fact, influence the enemy's ability to sustain its military operations. The Germans' laughter at the flying fortress was waning. Skepticism was replaced by cautious concern. For the crews, each mission became a test of endurance and resolve. Days were filled with briefings, target reconnaissance, and meticulous planning. Nights offered little rest. Sleep was often interrupted by the hum of engines or the creak of frost-covered airfields. Yet within this grueling routine, a sense of purpose grew. These men were pioneers of a new kind of warfare, facing a deadly combination of nature, technology, and human opposition. By mid-1943, the stage was set for the first major daylight raids on critical German industrial centers. The flying fortress once mocked would now confront the Reich's most fortified targets. Its resilience, combined with precise tactics and growing experience, promised to redefine the air war over Europe. The story of the B-17 is not merely a tale of metal and firepower. It is the story of the men who flew them, the technology that sustained them, and the tactics that allowed fragile crews to confront one of the most lethal air defenses the world had ever seen. Inside each flying fortress, 10 men faced a world suspended between sky and death. Pilots gripped yokes with frozen fingers, scanning for flak bursts that could shred wings in an instant. Bombardiers squinted through the Norden bomb sight, calculating trajectories with mathematical precision, knowing that a single error could mean mission failure or death. Gunners crouched behind 50-caliber machine guns, listening to the roar of engines and the whine of enemy fighters. Fear was constant, yet discipline and training forged a camaraderie stronger than steel. Letters home described frostbitten hands, cracked oxygen masks, and the deafening noise of formation flight, but also brotherhood and quiet pride. Survival often hinged not on luck alone, but on teamwork, instinct, and the unyielding reliability of the B-17 itself. The B-17 was a marvel of 1930s engineering, conceived to endure punishment that would down lesser aircraft. Its 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines provided redundancy. If one or even two failed, the bomber could maintain altitude and reach friendly territory. Armor plating protected critical systems, while self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of catastrophic fire. 13 defensive machine guns positioned in nose, tail, waist, and turret stations allowed overlapping fields of fire, deterring enemy fighters. Precision instruments, including the Norden bomb sight, enabled targeted strikes from 25,000 feet, high above most flak. Each feature was a calculated balance between speed, firepower, and survivability. In battle, these engineering choices translated directly to lives saved and missions completed. Flying a B-17 was not a solo endeavor. Success depended on formation integrity. Groups of fortresses flew in combat boxes, interlocking defensive fire to repel intercepting fighters. Pilots learned to maintain exact spacing, banking, and rolling in unison, while gunners covered adjacent aircraft with arcs of lead. Loss of cohesion could be fatal. Flak was another omnipresent danger. Even a near miss could shred a wing or disable an engine. Early missions revealed the importance of altitude, speed, and timing, forcing planners to adjust routes and departure schedules. Tactical evolution was constant. Every mission taught lessons, every loss refined doctrine. By 1943, formation tactics were precise, almost ritualistic, each plane acting as both weapon and shield for its neighbor. These 3 angles, human, technological, tactical, and converged in every mission. Crews relied on machines designed to survive under fire. Machines relied on human skill and judgment. Tactics dictated how both could be used effectively against an enemy determined to destroy them. Even as B-17s penetrated deeper into German airspace, the psychological stakes were immense. Every mission carried the weight of strategy and morality. Civilian areas often lay near industrial targets, raising ethical questions that crews confronted silently. The mental strain of anticipating flak bursts, fighter attacks, and mechanical failure was relentless. Sleep-deprived and exposed to bitter cold, crews had to maintain focus for hours at a time, trusting both each other and the aircraft. The human, technological, and tactical dimensions of the flying fortress were inseparable. The machine alone could not succeed, nor could human courage alone. Together they created a force capable of challenging Germany's industrial heart. Yet the Germans were adapting, learning the limitations and strengths of these bombers. The next phase of analysis would consider leadership, enemy response, and moral dimensions, angles that shaped the strategic evolution of the U.S. bombing campaign. The success of the B-17 campaign rested as much on command decisions as on the aircraft themselves. Generals such as Henry Hap Arnold and Ira Eaker championed daylight precision bombing despite heavy skepticism from both the Army and British allies. Arnold believed that crippling Germany's industrial capacity would shorten the war more effectively than mass ground assaults. Commanders in the field enforced strict formation discipline, mission planning, and navigation protocols. Briefings were exhaustive. Every cloud formation, anti-aircraft emplacement, and potential fighter interception was mapped. Orders emphasized cohesion and persistence, instilling in crews a sense of purpose and inevitability. Leadership decisions were sometimes controversial. The insistence on unescorted missions drew criticism after early heavy losses, but these choices shaped the doctrine that would eventually dominate the European air war. The Luftwaffe initially underestimated the threat of the flying fortress. German intelligence reports described the bombers as lumbering, slow, and fragile. But early missions proved costly. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, were formidable, yet often frustrated by the defensive firepower of the B-17 formations. Flak batteries over industrial centers inflicted severe damage, but precision strikes were harder to prevent than area bombing. German command gradually realized that these aircraft were not only survivable, but capable of reaching deep targets previously considered safe. The flying fortress forced the Luftwaffe to redeploy fighters, strengthen flak coverage, and adapt interception tactics, diverting resources from the eastern and western fronts. What had begun as ridicule turned into cautious, strategic concern. Daylight precision bombing carried moral weight. Industrial targets were often embedded within urban areas, and civilian casualties were inevitable. Bombardiers trained to strike with surgical accuracy, yet every sortie risked collateral damage. Crews confronted this silently, aware of both their mission's necessity and its human cost. Strategically, the raids were intended to cripple production of aircraft, tanks, and munitions, forcing Germany into reactive defense rather than proactive expansion. The moral tension of war was inseparable from the tactical reality. Industrial destruction could shorten the conflict and save lives in the long term, yet the immediate cost was stark. Letters from returning crews frequently acknowledged this duality: pride in their achievements, grief over the unavoidable suffering witnessed from above. The combined effect of leadership, enemy adaptation, and moral consideration reshaped the bombing campaign over Europe. U.S. doctrine evolved in real time, learning from each mission. Escort fighters extended the range and survivability of B-17s. Formation tactics were refined, maximizing defensive firepower while minimizing exposure. Intelligence and reconnaissance allowed planners to prioritize the most critical industrial hubs. In effect, the flying fortress became not just a bomber but a tool of strategic leverage, forcing Germany to spread its defenses, slowing production, and shifting resources away from offensive operations. The interplay of human courage, mechanical resilience, tactical innovation, and strategic oversight transformed the B-17 campaign into a decisive component of the Allied war effort. Crews endured the bitter cold, enemy fire, and moral ambiguity because each flight carried purpose beyond the individual. A calculated strike at the heart of the Reich's war-making capacity. The Germans' early laughter at the flying fortress was fading. Soon it would be replaced by a grudging acknowledgement of the threat these bombers represented. The stage was set for the decisive turning points, the raids that would force Germany to recognize the flying fortress as a weapon capable of reshaping the war. August 17, 1943. The sun rose over the English countryside with pale determination, casting long shadows across the airfields of East Anglia. Crews of the 8th Air Force climbed into their B-17s, engines rumbling in synchrony, forming lines of silver that glimmered under frost and morning light. Today they were bound for Schweinfurt, the industrial heart of Germany's ball-bearing production. A target essential to the operation of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles across the Wehrmacht. The flight over the North Sea was tense. Radio silence held, the distant rumble of engines the only companion. Pilots focused on formation, keeping the fragile lattice of bombers tight. Navigators monitored each course correction, aware that deviation could mean flak or fighters lurking over the continent. Below them, the German radar network and Luftwaffe patrols waited, poised to strike. As the American formation crossed into the Reich, the first explosions of anti-aircraft fire erupted. Flak shells climbed like steel geysers, detonating in clouds of smoke and shrapnel. Bombers wove through bursts, wings shuddering under concussive shocks. Gunners fired in disciplined arcs, each tracer round a warning, each burst a plea for survival. Enemy fighters appeared, Bf-109s diving from above, FW-190s racing head-on. The defensive fire of the B-17s turned the sky into a deadly lattice of lead and smoke. Despite the chaos, the bombers held formation. Precision mattered more than instinct. Bombardiers adjusted for wind, altitude, and speed, releasing payloads onto industrial targets with painstaking accuracy. The factories of Schweinfurt shuddered under the impact. Assembly lines paused and the production of crucial components slowed. Yet losses were heavy. Of the 291 bombers that crossed into Germany, nearly 60 were destroyed and another 60 damaged beyond repair. The sky was littered with falling aircraft and desperate parachutes, a grim testament to both the ferocity of the mission and the resilience of those who survived. The raid's intensity was mirrored just days later on Regensburg. On August 17th, a separate formation targeted the Messerschmitt aircraft works, aiming to cripple fighter production. Flying through relentless flak, bombers navigated by sight and instrument, each crew member aware that one misstep could be fatal. German fighters engaged in waves, testing every bomber's defensive coordination. Yet, even battered and wounded, the fortresses pressed on, delivering bombs directly onto the heart of the factories. The significance of these raids extended beyond immediate destruction. The Luftwaffe began to recognize that the American daylight strategy was more than a test. It was a commitment. B-17 formations could absorb punishment, continue to mission and return, forcing German commanders to reconsider air defense priorities. Anti-aircraft deployments were shifted, Luftwaffe units redeployed, and production hubs were forced to implement redundancies and camouflage. The B-17 was no longer a curiosity. It was a weapon of strategic consequence. On the ground, the Germans were forced to witness the unexpected. Factories damaged, workers killed or dispersed, and critical components delayed. What had begun as ridicule now carried grudging respect, a recognition of the Americans' willingness to risk heavy losses for precision destruction. High-ranking officers began documenting the threat in reports, noting the resilience of the aircraft and the skill of its crews. For the men in the air, every mission reinforced the lethal poetry of the flying fortress. Engines throbbed, guns roared, flak erupted like lightning. They were human cogs in a machine of iron and fire, each action precise, each decision a bridge between life and death. By the time the last bomber touched down on English soil, the message was clear. The age of the unchallenged Reich skies was ending. These raids, though costly, marked the first decisive turning point. German confidence in the invincibility of their industrial shield was shaken. The flying fortress had demonstrated not only durability, but the capacity to project American power deep into the Reich. It was a harsh prelude to the campaigns that would follow, where strategy, technology, and human courage converged in the crucible of daylight bombing. October 14, 1943. The sky over Germany was crisp, the sun a pale disk above the horizon. Over 300 B-17s lifted from England, bound for Schweinfurt once more. This mission, known as the Second Schweinfurt Raid, would test every lesson learned since August. Crews knew the stakes. Vital ball-bearing factories, the lifeblood of German machinery, lay ahead. Failure meant prolonging the war. Success required defiance against overwhelming odds. From the moment they crossed the North Sea, flak and fighters descended. Anti-aircraft fire erupted in precise, deadly bursts. The bombers wove through clouds of steel, engines straining against the weight of ordnance and altitude. Enemy fighters swarmed, a continuous wave of Bf-109s and FW-190s diving from above, head-on, and from the flanks. Yet the flying fortresses pressed forward. Formation discipline, perfected through months of grueling sorties, allowed overlapping fields of fire to repel many attacks. Bombardiers released payloads with painstaking accuracy. Factories shuddered under the impact, halting production temporarily. Despite tactical improvements, losses were catastrophic. Nearly 60 bombers were destroyed, many more crippled. Crews fought for survival in frozen cockpits. Oxygen masks slipping, bullets piercing fuselage and wing. Pilots coordinated evasive maneuvers while gunners returned fire relentlessly. Some planes, barely holding together, limped home on 2 engines. Fuselage shredded, instruments destroyed. Yet they arrived. Each surviving aircraft carried a message across Europe. The United States would not relent. These raids forced a strategic awakening within the Luftwaffe. German command realized that dismissing the flying fortress had been a grave miscalculation. Factories were not only vulnerable to daylight raids, but the fortresses themselves were durable beyond expectations. Luftwaffe units were redeployed to protect vital targets. Flak defenses expanded, and fighter tactics adapted to counter-formation flying. Yet each defensive measure strained German resources, diverting attention from frontline operations and slowing production elsewhere. The Americans' relentless pressure was fracturing the Reich's ability to sustain its war machine. The human dimension of these raids cannot be overstated. Crew fatigue, fear, and courage existed in a constant balance. Letters from survivors describe the visceral terror of flak bursts, the cacophony of fighter attacks, and the sight of comrades lost mid-flight. Yet the same accounts convey camaraderie, resolve, and the quiet satisfaction of completing an impossible mission. The flying fortress, for all its technological superiority, depended entirely on the skill, discipline, and bravery of its crews. By the end of 1943, daylight strategic bombing had matured into a calculated instrument of war. The B-17 was no longer an experimental tool. It was central to a broader Allied strategy aimed at crippling Germany's industrial backbone. Factories lay damaged, supply chains interrupted, and morale shaken. Reports from the Reich's military intelligence acknowledged the aircraft's resilience and effectiveness, while propaganda efforts attempted to downplay the psychological and material impact of these raids. The laughter that greeted the flying fortress in 1942 had vanished, replaced by strategic concern and grudging respect. The turning point was clear. The B-17 had proven its ability to penetrate deep into enemy territory, survive concentrated defensive fire, and deliver crippling blows to vital infrastructure. The Americans had not only demonstrated technological and tactical innovation, but had also shifted the psychological calculus of the air war. Germany could no longer assume its industrial heart was safe. Every mission carried the potential for disruption, loss, and demoralization. In the skies above Europe, the flying fortress had become more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of resolve, precision, and relentless pressure. The losses endured by the crews were immense, yet each sortie brought the Allies closer to weakening Germany's capacity for sustained warfare. The stage was now set for the aftermath, an industrial and psychological toll that would reverberate across the Reich and reshape the course of the air war over Europe. The skies over Germany, once confident and unchallenged, bore the scars of relentless American daylight raids. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and other industrial hubs were left smoldering. Assembly lines fractured, factories halted, and transport networks disrupted. Ball-bearing production, critical to tanks, aircraft, and artillery, suffered delays that rippled through the Wehrmacht's entire logistical system. Reports from intelligence officers highlighted the tangible impact. Even brief interruptions in production could delay frontline reinforcements and cripple offensive operations. The raids were not flawless, but the precision strikes demonstrated that daylight bombing could achieve strategic objectives previously thought unattainable. Human cost was staggering. Crews who survived recounted the violent ballet of fire and metal. B-17s returned riddled with holes, engines shot, fuel tanks pierced, yet intact enough to bring men home. Some aircraft had lost entire sections of fuselage or tail. Others were barely navigable on one engine. Casualty reports from the second Schweinfurt raid recorded nearly 60 bombers destroyed and over 550 airmen killed or captured. Survivors carried physical and psychological scars, frostbite, burns, and hearing loss, along with memories of comrades lost to flak bursts or fighter attacks. Yet these sacrifices were emblematic of the larger strategic gamble, the temporary devastation of factories in exchange for the long-term weakening of German military capacity. The German response was swift and instructive. Luftwaffe commanders realized that the flying fortress was more than a cumbersome target. It was a durable, precise instrument of strategic warfare. Anti-aircraft units were repositioned, flak guns concentrated around vital industrial zones, and night fighters developed to intercept formations. Factories implemented camouflage, dispersed production lines, and reinforced critical structures. Yet despite these measures, the Americans continued to strike, forcing the Reich to constantly adapt. Each mission compelled German industry and military planners to divert manpower and resources from offensive operations to defensive measures. Civilian life also felt the pressure. While precision bombing aimed to limit collateral damage, Urban areas near industrial centers experienced disruption, fear, and loss. Morale within the Reich shifted subtly but perceptibly. Reports indicate a growing awareness that the Allies possessed the means to strike deep within German territory, undermining both confidence and the propaganda narrative of invulnerability. Letters intercepted and analyzed by Allied intelligence reflected anxiety among factory workers and a recognition of the vulnerability of critical infrastructure. Strategically, the raids confirmed the validity of daylight precision bombing. Losses remained high, but they were calculated against long-term objectives. Each surviving bomber reinforced the American presence in Europe's skies, serving as both weapon and symbol. Commanders in the USAAF took careful note, refining tactics, improving formation discipline, and planning the integration of long-range fighter escorts. The lessons were harsh but invaluable. The combination of crew skill, aircraft resilience, and meticulous planning could yield results that German defenses could not fully counter. The aftermath of these early missions left an unmistakable impression. Factories slowed, enemy fighters were drawn into attritional battles, and German planners were forced to acknowledge the emergence of a new threat. The flying fortress had transcended its mechanical identity, becoming an instrument of psychological as well as physical warfare. Its presence in the skies represented not only destruction, but also the unyielding reach of American strategic power. These consequences set the stage for the long-term effects of the campaign. Industrial disruption, shifts in Luftwaffe strategy, and the steady erosion of German confidence in their ability to defend their homeland. The next section will explore these broader ramifications in detail, examining how the combination of loss, adaptation, and strategic pressure reshaped both sides of the conflict. By late 1943, the cumulative impact of daylight bombing raids was becoming clear. German industrial output had slowed, and the careful coordination of resources had been forced into reactive measures. Ball-bearing factories, aircraft production lines, and munitions plants were frequently disrupted, requiring repair and reconstruction that drew manpower away from frontline operations. Reports from Allied intelligence indicated that German production in some sectors dropped by as much as 30% in the months following sustained raids. The flying fortress, once dismissed as a fragile curiosity, had proven capable of delivering decisive blows deep into the Reich. Psychologically, the raids had a profound effect on both sides. In Germany, civilian and worker morale suffered under the realization that industrial hubs were vulnerable to repeated daylight strikes. Propaganda attempted to mitigate the impact, emphasizing resilience and the supposed inefficiency of American bombing. Yet internally, military intelligence and high-ranking officers began to acknowledge the growing threat of the USAAF. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin across multiple fronts, was forced to redeploy fighters, strengthen flak positions, and develop new interception tactics, all in response to a force that could absorb punishment and still complete its mission. For the Americans, the experience yielded invaluable lessons. Losses had been severe, yet they highlighted weaknesses that could be corrected. Long-range fighter escorts were integrated into planning, dramatically reducing casualties on subsequent missions. Formation tactics were refined, emphasizing tighter combat boxes and overlapping defensive fire zones. Navigational and bombing accuracy improved, aided by advances in radar and target intelligence. Each mission was a laboratory, testing aircraft, crew skill, and tactics under real combat conditions. The flying fortress became more than a bomber. It was a platform for experimentation and strategic refinement. The human element remained central. Crews adapted to the harsh realities of combat, enduring freezing temperatures, fatigue, and the constant presence of death. Letters and memoirs reveal the psychological toll. Watching comrades fall, witnessing the destruction of urban centers below, and facing the terrifying unpredictability of flak and fighters. Yet these same accounts describe extraordinary resilience, camaraderie, and a quiet pride in the precision and effectiveness of their missions. The flying fortress demanded not only skill and discipline but courage, and it rewarded those qualities with survivability and the opportunity to strike meaningful blows against the enemy. In operational terms, the success of the daylight campaign forced Germany to shift strategy. Production hubs were dispersed or camouflaged, flak concentrations increased, and fighter units were drawn away from other theaters. Resources that could have strengthened frontline units or reinforced occupied territories were instead devoted to countering the B-17 threat. The strategic balance began to tilt. The USAAF, despite heavy losses, gained the ability to influence enemy operations directly and consistently, shaping the trajectory of the European air war. By the end of 1943, the reputation of the B-17 Flying Fortress was firmly established. It had proven its durability, demonstrated the viability of precision daylight bombing, and forced Germany to acknowledge a new reality in the air war. The combination of technological innovation, human courage, tactical evolution, and strategic leadership had transformed the aircraft from an experimental bomber into a weapon capable of reshaping the conflict. The groundwork was laid for sustained campaigns that would continue to erode the Reich's industrial and psychological defenses. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is not merely a tale of machines in the sky. It is a chronicle of human endurance, technological ingenuity, and the relentless calculus of modern warfare. These aircraft, once dismissed as lumbering curiosities, became symbols of resolve. Steel and aluminum carrying men into the heart of enemy territory, against odds that would have broken lesser forces. Each sortie combined courage, skill, and trust. Trust in instruments, in fellow crewmen, and in the resilience of the aircraft itself. Strategically, the B-17 redefined the air war over Europe. Daylight precision bombing proved that industrial hubs were not invulnerable, and that sustained, disciplined aerial campaigns could shape the outcome of global conflict. Factories were destroyed, production slowed, and the Luftwaffe forced into reactive measures, stretching its resources thin across multiple fronts. The Flying Fortress compelled Germany to acknowledge a new reality. The skies above its heartland were no longer a sanctuary, but a contested domain where courage and innovation dictated survival. Yet behind every mission lay human cost. Frostbitten fingers, shattered eardrums, and lives lost to flak and fighter fire reminded the world that strategy and technology exacted a heavy toll. For every factory disrupted, there were men who never returned home, leaving behind families, comrades, and silent airfields that bore witness to their sacrifice. Their courage transformed a machine into an instrument of history, demonstrating the indelible link between human bravery and technological potential. The legacy of the Flying Fortress extends beyond WWII. It established doctrines of strategic air power that continue to influence modern military operations. It proved that precision, persistence, and planning could overcome seemingly insurmountable defenses. But most importantly, it remains a testament to those who flew into the storm, who embraced danger with discipline and resolve, and who reshaped history from the thin air above Europe. In the winter skies of 1943, the Germans laughed at the Flying Fortress. By the end of that year, those same skies were haunted by its presence, unyielding, precise, and relentless. The B-17 had changed the war, the course of industry, and the perception of what courage in the air could achieve. It was more than an aircraft. It was a herald of change.